So your textbook tries to explain where do we get this binary gender idea? Where do we get gender from anyway? If you look at the non-human primates or primates, you do see that there are different things that they do that seem based by biological sex, but it's not like they train their offspring differently or socialize them in different ways. It seems like humans are unique among animals, among the primates, and that we organize our societies around gender differentiations. Again, just be careful of these terms. There are different primates, there are differences of what they do based on biological sex, but again, they're not using the social differentiation of gender in order to socialize people differently, send them to different schools, dress them differently, all those things. That seems unique to human beings. That's our special thing. So they ask, well, where did this come from? It seems to perhaps have emerged early in the hominin stage, and they go back to those Laetoli footprints in the volcanic ash and interested in the size of the feet and if that illustrates sexual dimorphism. And as we've said, a lot of the fossil evidence is incomplete from that time, but they look at teeth to try and figure out if they were perhaps doing different activities back then. When it comes to the Neanderthals, for example, we have better archaeological evidence, but it's weird. What's weird about the Neanderthals? Yeah, it's interesting. At least with the Neanderthals, it suggests that they were both doing dangerous hunt activities. I don't know if they were together or separate, but yeah, they had a lot of physical trauma on there, or enough that it suggests that they were both engaged in this. They do think that they might have been doing different things. A lot of people have to do process animal hides, and that's often something that is assigned to women with their teeth. And so you see very distinctive tooth wear patterns. So there probably was different kinds of work. An interesting idea here that your textbook suggests. So for the most part, people have said, well, men had a biological advantage in terms of big game hunting, and that's why they got put into the hunting sphere. Your text raises the idea that it may have been not so much the men had an advantage in hunting, but the women had an advantage in doing childcare. And so if the women have this childcare advantage, then the guys can go off and hunt and fish and do those things. So it's an interesting turn. It's different from the idea that women are not capable of hunting, because we do see women hunting in various societies around the world are participating in that. But perhaps that the reason we see more men doing that is because the women were better at the childcare, which again, around the world, men are often involved in, but perhaps not as much. So again, the idea is that humans, because of their large-brained offspring, they needed to have more calories, which comes from the meats and the proteins in the hunt. And so one of the hypotheses suggested is that there was this division of labor. You have the women do the childcare, and you have hunters doing the specializing in the hunt. Interestingly, though, when you look archaeologically and sort of we're I think finding more evidence of this as we adjust our own archaeological biases, that we see some female skeletons or people that we would consider to be biologically female as seemingly doing big game hunting. And so some of this, we just have to be really careful about projecting our own ideas about what men and women do back into the past. And there's a great example of this with this skeleton and archaeological assemblage that was originally dug up in 1874, but then was reassessed. We have to be very careful when we dig up something in the past and we're like a bunch of weapons, a bunch of Viking stuff. that must be a guy. At least in the case of this skeleton, it turns out to be biologically female. Now, we don't actually know how this person identified. Who knows? It's hard to say, but what we don't want to assume is that this was just biologically male. I thought this was fascinating.
All right, so we just have to be careful when we're dealing with biological material or archaeological material, not to project our own assumptions about who was going to be what men and women could do back onto the past. We don't know necessarily what they thought. Our own assumptions are probably rooted in what we call patriarchy, which is that men are in positions of power or have dominant authority. And patriarchy is something that occurs in many societies around the world. It is a pretty common form of social organization. And it's probably especially linked to ideas of patrilineality and patrilocality. And we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, but patrilineal basically refers to how inheritance and wealth and other forms of power are passed down through the father's line. And patrilocality is simply the idea that when people get married, it is the woman who leaves their house and goes to reside in the village or the household of the man. And if you have this coincidence of patrilineality with patrilocality, it tends to emphasize male dominance in a society. Now, on the one hand, this occurs in many societies and is not unfamiliar from our own, but interestingly, it is not necessarily the rule in all different societies. So in this image, we see this is a Maori sculpture, you might say, from New Zealand, a carving, which shows the sky father and the earth mother. And basically their society was organized around complementary ideas is that men and women were distinct, but they had basically complementary and in some ways equal roles. What changed? How did this thing happen to the poor Maori? I'm not trying to say that patriarchy is only caused by colonialism, but there were many societies in which the European colonizers were not happy or didn't like the way that people were considered balanced or equal and wanted to introduce ideas that were more familiar to them. In other cases, it was simply taking what might have been less patriarchal societies and reinforcing them and making them more patriarchal. And so the Maori are a great example of that. I would say that in many indigenous societies in the Americas, that happens. But again, this is not to say that patriarchies were only formed by colonialism. There have been and are many societies outside of colonial rule, which are quite patriarchal. Your book makes the point it's important to realize is that just because a society is patriarchal doesn't mean that all the men in the society are equally beneficial. And men too can find themselves locked into roles and ideas and expectations in patriarchal societies. They give the example of what is called the Great Recession in the United States from 2007 to 2009, where it seems like the precariousness of male-centered jobs and employment went up, and with that, greater rates of depression and suicide. And so people in our current situation often say that in some ways, some of the things we are experiencing is the fact that these traditional roles that men are expected to do certain things are in a kind of flux or are sometimes more difficult to fulfill. And so people are reacting in various ways. So it's not necessarily that all men are going to be benefiting from a patriarchal system, even if as a society, the men have in general dominant authority. Are there any matriarchies in the world? For a long time, anthropologists said that there weren't matriarchies. There wasn't an equivalent to a patriarchy. It's rare, but there do seem to be some cases in which women at least have quite a lot of power in a society. In the case of the Menang cabal. For one thing, it is a matrilineal as opposed to a patrilineal society. So inheritance and those kinds of things are being passed down the female line. It is also a matrilocal society. So when people get married, the man is coming to the woman's village. In that kind of society, the father or the husband is not necessarily the most important person in your lineage. Your most important person, if you are a woman, would be your brother, who is in the line. And so husbands and fathers might not play such a big role. Now, in this society, men still have the elected political positions, but the women have a great deal of power over their and autonomy over their everyday economic arrangements. This, again, we don't know as much as we should because some of these societies were colonized long before we could study them. But this is probably true of many indigenous or Native American societies. Many of them are matrilineal and had a lot of power sharing, including female political councils. Your textbook refers to this, that it might be better called a diarchy, or a society in which power is shared between these groups. So it's unclear if there are true matriarchies that are parallel to patriarchies, but there are a lot of societies in which there is more power sharing or have been around the world. Now, before we get too excited about matriarchies and diarchies, it's useful to point out, it's important to realize that around the globe, there are still many disparities between the experiences of girls and women versus those of boys and men. There are still many health disparities around the world. There's still many places where girls are not expected to be educated or not even permitted to be educated. There are big differences in employment and wages and what you're able to do in various societies. Huge differences in reproductive rights around the world, in our own society, different states now. And in terms of what are known as LGBTQA plus recognition, or recognition of different kinds of gender and sexuality expressions. Again, this is very different in different places. And in our own society and around the world, there is still lots of gender-based violence, which is directed at women or people who differently identify. That tends to be still very true. So as much as we hope we have changed, around the world, this seems to still be the case. The chapter ends with the question of what is next for gender sex. Sure, you pronounce that little star in the middle of it. What next for gender sex, they ask. And for this slide, I just reproduced their words, what they said, that they wanted me to tell you from the textbook. That it is in flux globally, with women gaining more rights and innovations allowing physical transitions. And that modern communication, media, and social platforms provide avenues to question and redefine gender. What do you think? What is next? What next for gender sex? Is this where we're headed? What's going to happen to me the next time I teach this class? Fall of 2025. Oh, no, wait, I get to teach it in spring of 2025 too. And tell your friends. So our new president has made over 200 promises about what he's going to do on day one. So I don't know if he's going to be able to do all 200 of these things. But do you know what the number one promise he's made? The most repeated one? Yeah, I was surprised by this too. People have counted them up. The most repeated promise is that he's going to cut funds to schools that teach critical race theory. I don't know who those people are, but watch out. And transgender insanity. So the next time I teach this class, I'm going to get reported to the Transgender Insanity Office. In fact, you probably should report me now because I'm in trouble here. Because that's what I teach, is transgender insanity. So yeah, that's the first promise. I joke about being reported The second promise, the largest deportation operation in American history. And I hope some of this is just bluster and empty promises, but I would say buckle up, because bumpy ride coming ahead. So I don't know. We'll see. I'll try gender sex next time, but you might want to report me preliminarily. All right, what's next? Family, sex, love, and marriage. Sex, love, and marriage. Okay, we'll try that. Next class, sex, love, and marriage. Transgender insanity.